Project performance management principles, value, delivery, and lifecycle model. That's the topic for today. Week 2 focuses on how principles shape project performance and how delivery approaches affect the results. So this week connects the principles, performance, and value deliveries and lifecycle models. And we'll begin with the project management principles because they provide a foundation for understanding the guiding project performance. And then from there, we'll focus on PMBOK 7's emphasis on principles, value, and performance. And then we'll look at how PMBOK 8 updates the framework while keeping an integrated view of project performance. And then we'll shift in the second half of the presentation to looking at the application of the lifecycle models. So we'll examine the different development in lifecycle models, and we'll pay particular attention to their impact on project performance management. And then we'll draw together the takeaways on value and look at the importance of aligning performance management with the nature of the work. Project performance begins with principles that guide value for focused delivery. And so we're going to introduce this. This was a major shift in sort of modern project management with PMBOK 7. So rather than treating project success as simply meeting scope, schedule, and budget targets, PMBOK 7 frames project management as a value-focused discipline guided by principles. And in this view, principles shape how project leaders think, behave, and make decisions. And those decisions influence the performance and the delivery of the project's intended outcomes. And then PMBOK 8 keeps this value orientation, but defines the model or refines the model by simplifying the principles and reorganizing parts of the framework. So projects create value through outcome and benefits, not just through deliverables alone. So project performance should be evaluated by the value a project enables, not merely whether work was completed. You'll see this theme repeat through the presentation here, that the focus on value, because that's the key thing, sort of the key change that came about with PMBOK 7. And so you'll see this theme throughout the presentation. Essential idea in modern project management is that finishing the work on time and on budget and on scope by itself is not a true measure of success. Sort of the thinking prior to PMBOK 7 was that if you met those constraints, then the project was considered a success, whether the stakeholders were satisfied or not. And it led to a lot of problems with project management in general, and eventually led to sort of a split into the Agile project management model. A project may deliver all planned outputs, but still fail to create meaningful value. So some good examples, an example I can think of that comes right off the top of my head is the Opera House in Sydney, Australia. That thing took about 15 years to do and went way over budget, way over schedule, but it's considered maybe one of the wonders of the world. It's a key cultural asset to our Western culture. And we've got things like the Boston Big Dig. That project too took forever, lots of politics around it. People wanted to cancel it, and it's changed the whole area of the downtown Boston area, made it a much better place. So while those projects, by the technical definition, were considered failures, but by the value they generated, were considered successes. So in PMBOK 7, we shift our focus towards these. We became more intentional about benefits. So meaning that project performance should be assessed by whether the project actually contributes to organizational, society, or stakeholder needs or goals. And then PMBOK 8 makes this relationship even clearer by showing that deliverables lead to outcomes and outcomes lead to benefits, and benefits create value. So they've linked it together in PMBOK 8. It's an important shift because project performance management is not only about tracking activity. In other words, those other constraints are important, but it's also about assessing whether the project work is producing worthwhile results. PMBOK 7 marked a major shift by organizing project management around principles and performance domains rather than process-only structure. So one of the most important things to understand about PMBOK 7 is that it reflects a meaningful change from traditional project management model that we learn, many practitioners learned through the earlier editions of the PMBOK, especially PMBOK 6. PMBOK 6 emphasized legacy project management knowledge areas and processes, in addition to the familiar structures of inputs, tools, techniques, and outputs, and an emphasis on the triple constraints, those triple constraints of scope, schedule, and cost. We still have the inputs, tools, techniques, and outputs, and PMBOK 7 took those out and put them in that practice guide, a process groups of practice guide book. And now with PMBOK 8, we've kind of seen them bring a bunch of that, the tools, techniques, and outputs back. But it's more emphasized on the value that we can generate by using those. PMBOK 7 keeps the idea of disciplined project management, but it shifts towards these principles. And then we start looking at the performance domains that they have, and tailoring and structuring projects. So this was sort of all new stuff about 4 years ago. And so in other words, the focus then moved from primarily asking, what process should I follow, to how should I think, lead, and adapt and manage performance to achieve intended outcomes. So the focus of how project management is applied in projects shifted from just sort of tracking work and implementing plans to how should I lead, more leadership, more adaptive, more performance-oriented outcome. And so this is important in modern environments where projects may use an array of different approaches like predictive, adaptive, or hybrid delivery models. So like I mentioned earlier, a lot of organizations sort of pick one and want to apply everything to it, but we're seeing that starting to change, especially with a lot of the new tools we have like AI, things like that. It makes it a lot easier to create customized, context-oriented lifecycle models that are specifically based to deliver the value that you're trying to deliver. And PMBOK 8 helps confirm this by explicitly taking PMBOK 7 as the addition that moved from process-oriented mechanics to a more holistic, value-oriented, principles-based model. So now PMBOK 7 kind of marked that interim shift, and now we're moving forward into a sort of a new thing. And one of the things that I think I mentioned this in the last class or maybe in the last 6151, but there's Carletta Perez is an author of a concept that she talks about how technology changes and shifts. And there's a period where things shift from the old technology, old paradigm to the new paradigm. And so I would say we're kind of in that area. Agile's been around now for about 30 years. The traditional models have been around for about 40 some odd or even longer. And they're no longer really doing what they should be doing. And now we're seeing how we can restructure things to move to a new paradigm that's based on project context. And that's kind of this shift that we're talking about here. In the PMBOK 7, there's 12 principles that guide how we should think, act, and deliver value. And they're considered foundational principles that guide project performance. Unlike earlier traditional views of project management, which emphasize following these prescribed processes, the modern view is that the principles are intended to guide our behavior and judgment and decision-making across a wide array of project environments. They reflect how project leaders should think and act as they work with teams, stakeholders, risk, quality, complexity, and change. They also reinforce this broader shift in project management towards the value-focused, performance-oriented view. So rather than treating project success simply as a sequence of steps, PMI and modern project management now emphasizes principles that help project professionals adapt their approach while still pursuing value and strong outcomes. So in this sense, the principles support not only how projects are managed, but how project performance is shaped in practice. So they provide a practical foundation for our leadership, collaboration, and value delivery, quality, tailoring, risk response, adaptability, and change, the whole sort of domain of project management in general. They can help project managers exercise sound judgment in their context rather than a one-size-fits-all prescribed method. On the screen here is all of the 12 principles listed, and we'll take a little bit of a look at them here in just a second. This principle concept, my first exposure to this principle concept of work goes back to, I worked for a while as a consultant at Bridgewater Financial. Bridgewater is a company that was founded by Ray Dalio back in the 70s. And it actually became, and it may still be, the world's largest hedge fund. But at the time it was, when I was there. And Ray Dalio organized the whole company around principles. And the way he described them to us was that principles are essentially guidelines for which we should measure our actions. So we've got one here that says the first one is be a diligent, respectful, and caring steward. Well, how are we behaving? Are we being good stewards of the resources and the project and the organization? That's the principle. So how much have we diverged from that principle? So we can use these things as guidelines to enable our behavior, so to speak, and use them these project principles are set up the same way in the Agile Manifesto. Those of you that are in an Agile program, the Agile Manifesto has 12 principles and same concept. They also have 4 values that they have. We talked about the values of project management last time, talking about the ethics. Well, that all carries over. You'll see how the concept of project ethics influence the development of these project management principles. The principles are easier to understand when we can group them into themes that shape performance. So we can group them into leadership, collaboration, value, and adaptation. And we can understand them more easily when we group them this way. The first theme is leadership and stewardship. This emphasizes responsible conduct and behaviors that are expected of project leaders. The second principle is collaboration, which highlights the importance of building effective teams and engaging stakeholders. The third is context and adaptation, which includes project tailoring, which is basically customizing the project, systems thinking, complexity, risk, adaptability, and change. And the final theme is value and quality, which keeps attention on outcomes, usefulness, and integrity of project work. And so by grouping principles this way, we can see that the principles are not just a random list. It's an integrated way of thinking about how project performance works in real-world settings. We can apply these to our real-world context. Leadership and stewardship are foundational to responsible project performance. So the first theme, as we mentioned, is leadership and stewardship, because project performance depends more on just good execution. Stewardship is a principle of responsible conduct, and it emphasizes acting with integrity, with care, trustworthiness, accountability, while recognizing that project decisions have broader consequences. So we need to think more broadly about what we're trying to do. And in that sense, stewardship is about how responsibility and ethics are carried forward in our projects. And leadership complements stewardship by focusing on the direction, the influence, decision-making, and guidance that effective project leaders need to do more than just assign tasks. They help teams move forward with intended outcomes, support and sound decisions, and they create alignment around the project work. And so the principles show that responsible project performance requires both ethical conduct and effective leadership behavior. And stewardship shapes how this is exercised, and leadership shapes how performance is guided. So these are 2 foundational areas of our project management principles. The next theme is people and collaboration. Collaboration and stakeholder engagement are essential to effective project performance. So PMBOK 7 emphasizes that project performance depends heavily on how well people work together, both within the team and across the broader stakeholder and project environment. A collaborative project team environment supports communication, coordination, trust, and a shared commitment to project outcomes. The Project Management Institute also highlights that stakeholder engagement is a separate but closely related principle. So effective projects don't simply manage stakeholder reactions after decisions are made. Instead, they guide stakeholders early throughout the project so that expectations, concerns, and interests are better understood. So these principles show that project performance is shaped by relationships as much as they are by processes. So it's a relationship amongst the team, the collaboration that takes place, and the stakeholders. Teams that collaborate effectively and engage stakeholders are better positioned to solve problems, sustain alignment, and deliver results that others will support, so that our stakeholders will support. The next theme is context and adaptation. Tailoring, complexity, risk, and adaptability and change are essential to effective project performance. This makes it clear that project performance is not achieved through a one-size-fits-all approach, like I talked about earlier. Instead, project teams are expected to tailor their methods, their processes, and decisions to the specific context of the project and the project environment. This includes the environment, stakeholder needs, constraints, the level of uncertainty, the nature of the work itself. This theme also brings together several related principles. The project's operating environment is shaped by complexity, risk, and change, so effective performance depends on recognizing those realities and responding appropriately. PMI explicitly includes principles for navigating complexity, optimizing risk responses, embracing adaptability and resiliency, and enabling change to achieve the envisioned future state of our project, which is value delivery. So in practice, this means that strong project managers and project leaders don't simply follow a fixed method. They adapt their approach to remain flexible, respond thoughtfully to uncertainty, and help stakeholders move from the current state to the intended future state that we're trying to achieve with the project. This is why context and adaptation are performance issues, not just planning preferences. So they're how we structure all this early on in planning, but when we get into executing the project or performing the project, these issues can help us understand why we're doing what we're doing, the intent that we're looking for. The fourth theme is value and quality. Value and quality are essential to project performance because successful projects must produce useful outcomes with integrity. Project performance is not only about completing work, but it's about producing outcomes that are useful and meaningful. And the focus on value directs attention to benefits, stakeholder needs, and alignment with organizational priorities. And so in this sense, value helps define why the project matters. Quality complements value by emphasizing that project works and deliverables should be fit for purpose, reliable, and carefully developed. PMI treats quality as something that should be built into processes and deliverables, not inspected at the end. This is a general accepted quality management approach. And that means that quality is part of the performance throughout the project's lifecycle. It's not just something we talk about in the beginning and measure at the end. It's something that we pay attention to throughout the project's lifecycle. Together, value and quality help define what strong project performance should produce. Projects should create results that matter, and those results should be delivered in a way that meets expectations and supports confidence in the outcome. We'll focus a little bit on value here because value is probably the key principle because it helps projects leaders judge performance by results that matter. So one of the most important principles is focus on value. This principle matters because it helps clarify what strong project performance really means. And it reminds leaders to look beyond internal execution metrics and ask whether the project is producing results that matter. And we see this in some of the adaptive models more explicitly because every increment or every interval where we're trying to do our next increment planning, we're looking at feedback from stakeholders to give us some insight into whether or not we're actually delivering the value that they're expecting. In more predictive models, this is maybe done less collaboratively, but we're still want to be intentional about producing prototypes, introducing the work we're doing to our stakeholders so that we can get this information back. So in practice, this means connecting the work to the stakeholder needs and intended benefits and organizational priorities. And it's usually done through this collaboration that we talked about, one of the themes that we talked about earlier. So a team may complete planned activities effectively, but performance is stronger when those activities contribute to the useful outcomes and meaningful benefits. And we get that by applying this to our stakeholders or our bigger project community to validate our deliverables and whether or not they deliver value. And this improves the decision-making throughout the project. For instance, when trade-offs come up, so we have to choose between one priority. So it helps us guide these priorities. It helps us guide trade-offs with use or resource use. It helps us guide trade-offs with stakeholder interaction. It helps us guide conversations towards what's most important. And this idea connects directly to project performance management, because managing project performance is not simply tracking what we're doing. It's about determining whether or not we're doing something that is expected and it's going to generate value. And so value is a key principle because it helps to define what project performance means. PMBOK 7 organized the performance into 8 independent domains. It treats project performance as an integrated system of interdependent domains, not as isolated work. So after kind of looking at the principles and their themes, the next step is to see where those principles operate in practice. And we do this in PMBOK 7 through the 8 performance domains. And a performance domain is a group of related activities that are essential to effective delivery of the project outcomes. And they're not intended to be treated as independent silos. They're interconnected and that they're interactive, interrelated, and interdependent with each other. In other words, project performance is shaped by how these domains work together as a unified whole. That this integrated view is important because project results are rarely explained by one factor. Stakeholder issues affect delivery, team capability influences planning and project work, and measurement informs decision. Uncertainty affects nearly every other domain. Strong project performance requires a holistic understanding of how these areas connect and reinforce each other. PMBOK 8 keeps this integrated system view, but reorganizes the project performance domain. So the integrated system view of project performance around project value and management focus. And since the course was written around PMBOK 7, that's the primary framework that we're looking at. But it's helpful to note how PMBOK updates this model because that's where we're moving forward to. PMBOK 8 keeps the idea that project performance should be understood as an integrated system, but it reorganizes the framework into 7 project management performance domains into governance, scope, schedule, finance, stakeholders, and risk. These domains, again, are interactive, interrelated, interdependent areas that focus on the work, and all of this together deliver project value. An important shift is that PMBOK 8 describes these domains as supporting effective delivery of project value, while PMBOK 7 describe the domains as supporting effective delivery of project outcomes. This is a real subtle but meaningful refinement in emphasis. PMBOK 7 introduced this concept of focus on value, tailor based on value, but it still was more on the outcomes that we produce, which is sort of a carryover from the legacy view of the traditional project management. Here, PMBOK 8 makes this very clear. But PMBOK 8 also reintroduces process group logic as 5 focus areas. So in PMBOK 6, we had what we call process groups: initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, and closing. And the emphasis was that we execute these processes and measure the outcome of those processes. So that's where the project outcome focus comes from. Now we're kind of looking at these things as focus areas. So we want to focus on initiating, we want to focus on planning, we want to focus on executing, monitoring, and controlling and closing, but we're focused on them only as to how they produce value. And all or some of the processes may or may not be applied depending on the lifecycle model that you find yourself in. So PMI explains that market feedback supported simplifying these principles and reintroducing process groups as focus areas and into the guide, the PMBOK guide. So now they've kind of, what they had taken and put into the practice groups, they've moved a big bunch of that back into the PMBOK, but it's all reorganized into these focus areas instead of into a linear process group focus. Although projects do tend to follow these 5 basic areas, regardless of the life cycle model. Every project has a beginning and a middle and an end. So every project has a executing, a planning, an initiating and planning piece, an executing piece, and a closing piece. So the major takeaway is that with PMBOK 8, it doesn't discard performance domain concept from PMBOK 7. It restructures it into a more management focused model, at the same time preserving the integrated system perspective. So that's why PMBOK 7 is still useful, but we transitioned to PMBOK 8. Here it's as part of the next evolution in project performance management. PMBOK 8 preserves PMBOK 7, as I've mentioned, its integrated system view while simplifying and restructuring it for application. So now that we've looked at PMBOK 7 and PMBOK 8 separately, we can compare them here, and it looks maybe a little easier to interpret. So as I mentioned, PMBOK 8 doesn't reject the performance domain idea introduced in PMBOK 7. In both editions, performance is treated as an integrated system in which major areas of project work interact and reinforce one another, but the difference is in how the framework is organized. PMBOK 7 uses 12 principles and 8 performance domains with language centered on delivering project outcomes, with the assumption that value is going to come from that. PMBOK 8 simplifies the principles into 6 principles, reorganizes the model into 7 project performance domains, and adds 5 focus areas that bring back a more structured lens. So we're getting the adaptive and structured lens kind of merged together here, and it shifts emphasis from outcomes towards squarely on project value. So this course, again, PMBOK 7 is the primary framework we're looking at because we're in this transition phase, and because PMBOK 8 was just introduced this year. But it's important because it shows where we're moving to. We're moving towards a simpler, more consolidated model that preserves the idea that project performance must be understood holistically rather than just an isolated executing of tasks. Now we're going to move into the development approach and lifecycle choices and how they shape project performance is managed. So it's the second topic. This is the shift that we're going to make. In PMBOK 7, the development approach and lifecycle are performance choices, not just delivery mechanics. So up to this point, we focused on principles in performance domain. Our next step here is to connect those ideas to how projects are actually structured and delivered. PMBOK 7 treats development approach and lifecycle and performance domain because these choices directly affect how project work is organized, how often value is delivered, and how performance is managed over time. This explains that the type of deliverable helps determine the development approach, where I was alluding to in the beginning of the presentation. The development approach influences the delivery cadence, whether it's iterative or a phased approach or incremental approach, and those choices together shape the life cycle in its phases. That means that life cycle is not just an administrative sequence. It's part of the performance delivery strategy. And this is important because project managers don't select predictive or adaptive or hybrid models in a vacuum. They select them based on the nature of the work and the degree of uncertainty, stakeholder needs, and the type of value the project is expected to produce. So as I mentioned earlier, the traditional view is that you adopt a standard life cycle that your organization does or your consulting company does. There's like the Accenture approach, or there's the what's the other one? Massey approach. The big consulting companies, they all have their own standard model that they try to fit everything into. Well, with modern project management, we're seeing that shift to where we look at what are we trying to accomplish and what life cycle can we construct to deliver, to be successful at that. And I've mentioned earlier too that AI and a lot of the modern tools that we have these days help enable us to be able to shape project performance in that way. Predictive, adaptive, and hybrid approaches fit different levels of uncertainty and change. So project performance improves when the development approach fits the project uncertainty, change rate, and deliverable needs. One of the things that's seen over the years is that there's always this chaos as organization that does reporting on project performance. And for years, they reported that the failure rate of projects was somewhere around 60-something%, in that stakeholders were unhappy. Only 30% or so of projects succeeded, and even amongst those that succeeded were maybe they didn't meet all stakeholder expectations. And that led to an evolution into the Agile world where the idea was that by focusing on more focus on feedback and things like that would improve. And it did improve projects delivery about 15%, which is a huge, we went from 30 to about 45% or so, which was a huge benefit. If you think about the money that's spent on projects, it's in the hundreds of billions of dollars, maybe trillions of dollars, but it kind of stalled out. When we look back at why it stalled out, it's, well, even though we're using adaptive models, we selected an adaptive approach. Is it Scrum? Is it Kanban? Is it some framework, scaling framework like Scaled Agile framework, things like that? Well, those all were still, even though they were more adaptive and more focused on value, they were still a one-size-fits-all kind of approach. So now the view is we kind of start with one of these and using tailoring, essentially what we wind up with in this hybrid world altogether. So project performance improves when our approach fits the nature of the work. Predictive approaches are generally more appropriate when requirements are stable and the work can be planned in advance and change is relatively limited. So a construction project is probably a good example. And I also view predictive projects that work better when there's lots of logistics involved. And a construction project is a good example of that. But you can have other types of projects where you've got to have materials in place, like manufacturing on time. You got to have people in place at certain times. There's contingencies. So there's a lot of dependencies. Projects that have lots of logistics and lots of interdependencies or lots of external dependencies are much more complex. And I find that predictive models work better in those environments. Adaptive approaches are more useful when requirements are evolving and uncertainty is higher and teams need rapid feedback and iterative delivery. So one of the issues we had early with software development is that the software engineers would go off and do their things based on the requirements they got from the stakeholders. The issue was that this interpretation from what the stakeholders wanted to what the software development team thought they needed resulted in a quality gap, and it caused a lot of problems. So by developing a more adaptive approach, like a Scrum model, then we're getting feedbacks every 2 weeks, and we're not really defining anything. We're only focusing on high level. We put together a product roadmap. We get feedback in the final product that we produce or the final value we deliver may be significantly different than what our expectations were in the beginning, in that the requirements kind of evolve in this way. But many projects fall in between, which is why we have hybrid approach. And that's where I think modern project management is going, that pretty much everything we do, it could be a context-based model, which by definition is sort of a hybrid model. What hybrid models do is they combine elements of predictive and adaptive methods so that the project can maintain a structure where needed, but remaining flexible where we have change is expected. And this is an important point when it comes to project performance. It's not just a methodology preference. It affects planning, stakeholder engagement, delivery cadence control, and the project's ability to respond to new information quickly. Choosing the wrong approach can reduce performance, and even when the team has all the capabilities and they're committed, if we're trying to apply the wrong model to the wrong expected outcome, it is an impediment for the overall project, everybody involved. PMBOK 8 treats development approaches as a spectrum selected to fit project conditions or the context I've been speaking about. And it builds on Project 7 by presenting predictive, hybrid, and adaptive approaches in the spectrum that are chosen to fit project conditions. So it keeps the same 3 core development approaches that we have in PMBOK 7, the predictive, the hybrid, and adaptive approaches. What it adds is a clearer explanation of what these approaches should be viewed as a spectrum rather than as rigid categories. I think sort of the way that they looked at it in PMBOK 7 is there was a clear demarcation point between each approach. PMBOK 8 says, well, we have this spectrum and we may have elements of all of these in one project that we're looking at. So PMBOK 8 gives us more explicit guidance for how to determine which model to apply and which model we're in. It points to factors such as the uncertainty of the requirements, the stability of the scope, the ease of change, the delivery options, the risk involved, the stakeholder involvement, safety requirements, regulations, and overall project complexity. The ease of change is an important one. Ease of change usually is the cost of change is usually related to the ease of change. And if the cost of change is expensive, you're more likely to see predictive models involved because there's a more formalized process when there's more cost involved to fund those changes. And it's kind of the same thing for all of these. You have to look at the intensity of each one of these factors. So when requirements are clear and stable, the predictive model may be best. If we've talked about when requirements are uncertain and feedback is needed, the adaptive approach may be more effective. And again, in many modern projects, a hybrid approach is the best fit. This slide here reinforces that project performance, selecting a development approach is not just a methodology choice. It's a performance decision that matches the realities of the project. So we can influence this when we're planning, if we're planning with the performance of the project in mind. And that's where planning strategy and delivery strategy, performance delivery strategies overlap. It's an important overlap point to note when you're structuring your project. Different lifecycle models structure work, feedback, and delivery in different ways. Lifecycle models provide different ways to structure project work, learning, and value delivery over time. Now that we've discussed and covered development approaches, the next step is to look at the lifecycle models that organize how project work unfolds over time. The lifecycle approach is a planning decision or may be determined by the organization like in the project management office or something like that. Again, this is changing with the evolution of more context-based approach to project management. But the predictive life cycle is more linear and more sequential with major phases that are completed in order. And this tends to follow, if you lay these out and they show it on the slide here, this little Gantt chart view icon, sort of follows a waterfall sort of structure, and that's where the waterfall project management approach comes from. It's when people say waterfall, they're really referring to a linear predictive model that requires upfront planning and stable requirements. An iterative cycle uses repeated cycles to define understanding, explore option, and clarify requirements. Most of the Agile models come under the adaptive iterative approach. Adaptive is sort of an umbrella, and the iterative and incremental approaches follow under that as separate approaches. But most of the Agile approaches use both. They use an iterative approach for planning and doing work, and they use an incremental approach for delivering value. So an iterative cycle's repeated to refine understanding. That's where that iterative planning comes in, the exploration of options and clarifying these requirements through that feedback I was talking about. The incremental life cycle delivers pieces of capability over time. So stakeholders begin receiving value early before the entire project is complete. And that's an important factor of some of the adaptive incremental approaches. So PMBOK 7 explains that iterative development is useful for clarifying requirements while incremental development adds functionality. That's why we see these usually together under some kind of an adaptive approach, adaptive or agile lifecycle. They combine this incremental and iterative delivery and introduce frequent feedback and ongoing adjustment. In hybrid life cycles, combine structured and flexible elements, and this is useful when some parts of the project are stable and while others are uncertain. My experience here that I've had with this kind of environment is I was working with Texas Instruments, the calculator people, the TI calculators. And the calculators have the hardware part of the calculators have a very linear approach because all the parts have to be created, have to be delivered into the assembly line. The calculator has to be put together. But the software part of it, even though it's some mathematics, it's how the user interface is done. There's a lot of uncertainty and that sort of thing. So that was hybrid. Now, the way we did that is we kind of managed each part of that as separate approaches and then integrated them through iterative model. So we would have the hardware report in the software. We'd organize those together to clarify requirements and to learn and adapt what we're doing. But there are also projects where you've got some parts of it, like maybe a stakeholder, you have a procurement, say a fixed price contract of some kind that you're working towards. You may have to be more predictive in that, while you could still put in things like daily synchronization or daily stand-up meetings, all those sort of code reviews, product demos, stakeholder panels, all those sort of things, integrate those into your predictive model to be more flexible. In PMBOK 7, it explained that iterative development is useful for clarifying, but incremental adds functionality. So that's what we're talking about. The larger point here is that lifecycle design is not just a administration thing. It's something the team needs to get involved in because it shapes how learning over the project lifecycle occurs, how we generate and evaluate and employ feedback, how it's incorporated in the project, and how value is delivered throughout the project. Lifecycle development approach are, like, again, a sort of planning decision, but they're shaped by organizational governance, and that directly affects the project performance. So lifecycle and development approach are planning and government decisions that shape project performance. And the key point here is that the lifecycle and development approach are not usually casual choices made midway through execution. They're usually something that we decide up front. And the planning decisions are made early in the project and are often influenced by the organizational governance and PMO practices, contract terms, and standard methodologies. The PMI official kind of word for this is called environmental enterprise factors. And you'll see that throughout the books on how they just say that it's a significant input to most everything we do. PMBOK 7 notes that organizations often provide a project methodology or general development approach as a starting point, and that some tailoring decisions require approval to ensure alignment with policy and strategic goals. And we covered this pretty well in the planning course, but it's this looking at a project as a system within a organization, and that we want to make sure that what we're doing aligns with the organizational strategy and goals. And so some of the decisions that we make may need to be approved for strategy alignment, things like that. And this matters because how we align the strategy is going to affect how we're going to manage our project. And the development approach influences how much and when planning is conducted. So we may have a predictive approach where we do lots of planning up front and maybe not do any more significant planning throughout the project. Or we may decide that we want to do phases, or we may want to do an incremental approach, or we may want to do some kind of daily approach. We can, all those things influence those items, how we're going to plan, how much we're going to, when we're going to conduct it, things like that. Predictive work often requires more upfront planning, while adaptive work uses high-level planning. So we put high-level planning is generally in an adaptive, agile, iterative approach. It's usually considered roadmap, like a roadmap. And we'll have a roadmap that has high-level deliverables on it or features on some kind of time horizon. It may be that we identify these features out maybe 3 months, 6 months, or a year, but we don't define them in detail until we get close to them. So hence the roadmap concept. The closer we get to it, the more things become in detail, the more detail we can see. So we want to plan that detail at the time it's important to do it, because what happens a lot of times when we do upfront planning, if we don't control change effectively, and even if we do control change effectively, change happens, and we have to handle that change. And the adaptive models change that throughout the project performance, where the predictive models try to control that change throughout the performance. And by control, I mean we want to make sure that necessary change gets implemented. We just want to make sure that we don't spend time and resources on necessary change. With the adaptive models, oftentimes we can integrate change that's maybe I don't want to say skeptical, but may result in that we don't need it, but we don't know we don't need it until we actually try it out. And so that's where we can try to do that with the adaptive methods. From a performance management perspective, all this is important because the life cycle and development approach established a structure within which we're going to deliver and measure and adapt the project, where it's all going to occur within the project plan. A poor fit can weaken our performance. So a well-chosen fit strengthens alignment between the project and the organization and the outcomes and what the project is expected to deliver. The different models require different performance management approaches. So we can see selecting these, they got different management styles, different approaches. The life cycle model changes how planning, measurement, control, risk response, and stakeholder engagement are managed. The important for this course is that life cycle models do more than just organize work. They shape how project performance is managed. The selected life cycle affects how planning is undertaken, and predictive life cycles typically do most of the planning up front, as we mentioned, and adaptive rely on more shorter planning horizons, as an example. The life cycle also changes how uncertainty and stakeholder feedback are handled. PMBOK 7 notes that a deliverable with regulatory risks may use a predictive approach to build in more testing, documentation, and more robust procedures, while work with high stakeholder acceptance risk may use an iterative approach to in early releases to gather feedback before expanding functionality. So they're talking about here a hybrid approach within the same project where we have these two dimensions taking place. PMBOK 8 makes this more explicit in schedule management. It says predictive life cycles usually define the schedule up front with baselines and formal change procedures, which is a throwback to the more traditional stuff. But adaptive life cycles use time box planning and flexible schedules. And hybrid life cycles combine this high-level predictive structure with adaptive execution for fast changing components. So what they're talking about here is using a predictive approach early in the project to do more detailed planning than we might do normally with an adaptive approach, but then during execution, manage the project performance with a more adaptive approach in order to take advantage of changing things on the fly. From a performance management perspective, the life cycle model determines how much planning happens early and how that we manage performance, how change is controlled, how risk is addressed, and how often stakeholders are involved. That's why selecting a life cycle is a performance decision, not a delivery preference. So you can see the theme we're talking about here. But it's important to know which place you're in. And we'll go through, in the courses, we'll go through the different performance domains and talk about how adaptive and predictive models relate to those domains. Predictive models manage performance through baselines, phase control, and formal change management. So in predictive projects, performance management emphasizes this upfront planning and baseline control and formal change management, as I mentioned. It's most effective when requirements are reasonably stable and the work is planned in detail early. In this environment, project performance management depends heavily on establishing clear baselines for those triple constraints that I mentioned earlier, the scope, schedule, and cost, and then monitoring those performance against approved plans. So the predictive models are more of a traditional approach. This means the project manager places strong emphasis on planning, phase reviews, milestone review control, variance analysis, informal change management. So we have formal change management procedures, we have variance analysis like earned value management, and milestone control, meeting things on time, and having phase reviews, gate reviews. All those sort of things are considered predictive tools and techniques. Performance is judged by how costly the project tracks the agreed plan and how closely, performance is judged by how closely the project tracks the agreed plan and how effectively deviations are identified and addressed. This doesn't mean the predictive projects are rigid in an unbeneficial or unhelpful way. It just means that control is achieved through defined expectations, documented plans, and disciplined project performance review. That approach is especially useful when the project operates in a regulated environment, has contractual requirements, or involves deliverables that meet tightly defined specifications. Like in my example with the calculator hardware, it had to meet very specific engineering specifications. From a performance management perspective, the predictive model's strength lies in its clarity, so things are clear. The team knows what the targets are, the organization knows the commitment, and performance can be measured against a baseline. So we want to know what the variance from the baseline. And the tendency is to stay as closely aligned with the baseline as we can. So if we monitor variance and keep track of trends, we can take action to bring the project back within alignment. Adaptive models arrange performance through short cycles, feedback, and continuous adjustment. Adaptive projects performance management emphasizes these short planning cycles, the rapid feedback, and ongoing reprioritization. So every iteration, we're going to be reprioritizing what we're going on. Adaptive models are most useful when requirements are uncertain, change is expected, and learning must occur throughout delivery. For instance, we don't really understand what the final outcome is going to be, the final value, how we're going to deliver the value in the beginning. We have to learn how we're going to do what that looks like throughout delivery. In this environment, the project performance management depends less on locking down detailed plans at the beginning and more on managing performance through short cycles, rapid feedback, and frequent review. This means the project manager and the team focus on time box work. So we set 2 weeks iterations or 1 month iterations. The sort of the guidance is that you have 8 to 2 weeks with the emphasis on the shorter. And most projects have been focusing on a month, or with software, the 2 week ones. So it's usually 2 weeks is kind of where everything's settled for software development. This means that the team need to focus on regular stakeholder input, iterative learning through these iterations, and ongoing reprioritization. Performance is judged not by whether the work is completed, but whether the team is learning quickly, responding effectively, and delivering value in each cycle. And so we have tools now to enable continuous deployment, continuous delivery, continuous integration. And the idea is we want to have this constant value delivery perspective. And from a performance management perspective, adaptive models require a different mindset than predictive models. Control is not achieved mainly through rigid baseline adherence. It's achieved through cadence, transparency, review, and disciplined ability to adjust based on new information. The strength of the adaptive model is its responsiveness. It helps teams manage uncertainty, improve stakeholder alignment, and deliver value even when the final solution can't be fully defined at the start. Iterative and incremental models manage performance through learning and usable delivery over time. They emphasize learning, refinement, and delivery of usable value in stages. So iterative and incremental models sit strictly between predictive planning and fully adaptive delivery. They are especially useful when the project team needs to learn, refine, and deliver value progressively. In an iterative model, repeated cycles iterations help the team clarify requirements, explore options, and improve the solution over time. In an incremental model, the project delivers usable increments of value in a step-by-step fashion rather than waiting till the very end to deliver. And from a performance management perspective, this changes what we have to pay attention to. Performance is not just only by adherence to one fixed baseline, and it's not managed solely through rapid prior. It's as in a highly adaptive environment. Instead, performance is judged by whether each cycle improves understanding, whether each increment delivers something useful, and whether learning from one stage improves the next. Like in the Scaled Agile framework, which is the big scale enterprise level framework, they plan what they call increment planning. And increments are usually 12 weeks with 2 week iterations in between. But at the end of that 12-week, the last 2 weeks of that 12-week iterations is specifically focused on this concept of improving understanding, learning, before we move into the next increment, the next 12 weeks that we're going to do. And so they've kind of got that explicitly built in. A lot of the Agile methods do this. We can also build these kind of things in to the predictive models to strengthen them as well. Things like stakeholder feedback. So this makes stakeholder feedback very important. As usable pieces of the software or the product are delivered, the project team gains information that can help improve later work. So I thought I wanted this to behave this way, but now that I've got my hands on it, I need it to do something else. And that's the kind of feedback that we're looking at. This means that performance management includes tracking both progress and learning, as well as whether partial deliveries are producing meaningful benefit along the way. The strength of an iterative and incremental model is that it may reduce uncertainty gradually while also allowing value to appear earlier than a fully end-loaded project. And this can be important if you're trying to self-fund the project. If you can deliver value that, say, delivers some kind of financial value to the organization, that those monies can be funneled back to the project to help fund it. It's kind of a one real good advantage of this incremental delivery that we're talking about. Hybrid models manage performance by balancing structure, flexibility, and fit. So it combines the predictive control with this adaptive learning to fit different parts of the work. Hybrid models are useful when the project includes both stable and uncertain elements. Some part of the work may benefit from predictive planning, formal controls, and phase-based management, while other parts may require adaptive cycles and rapid feedback and frequent adjustment. So the purpose of a hybrid model is not to mix methods randomly, but it's to create a better fit between the work and the way that performance is managed. From a performance management perspective, hybrid models require that the project manager oversee multiple control logistics at the same time, or one work stream may be tracked against a detailed baseline, while another is managed through short iterations and evolving priorities, like the example that I gave you. That means that performance management becomes more intricate, it's more integrated. And the challenge is not only managing each stream well, but also keeping them aligned. That's why hybrid models can be powerful in real projects. They can help us move that success rate up. They allow a team to maintain structure where predictability matters, while preserving flexibility where learning and change are expected. The strength of this model is the fit, but the management model is its challenge is its coordination. This requires skilled project managers, and this goes back to one of my basic philosophies in the whole project management program we have here at Amberton, is that we want you to come out of the program, regardless of which one it is, whether it's the MBA or the MS in Agile, with a good foundational structure so that you can be a better coordinator. You can be an effective project management, not just managing people and all of that, but coordinating work amongst stakeholders, amongst models, in sort of a large holistic view of how project management works. In practice, this leads to a strong ability to increase hybrid performance. And this strong hybrid performance management depends on clear governance, careful interface management, that's that project management talked about, and a deliberate understanding of which parts of the project will require control versus adaptation. And that's where your individual project management skills come in. And this is one of the things that I've said in other classes, is that this is where I think helps to leverage, gives us leverage in the AI implementation. We'll be able to take advantage of all kinds of tools to help automate a big chunk of the work that gets done, but there still requires that human understanding of which parts of the project require control and coordination versus adaptation. It's an important thing that project managers do. Project performance management should change with the lifecycle model because planning, control, and feedback and delivery are handled differently. So the different models manage project performance through different control and delivery logistics, like I talked about earlier. And so after looking at each model individually, the key takeaway is that project performance management is not a one-size-fits-all thing. The model chosen for the project shapes how planning is done, how progress is measured, how change is managed, and how stakeholders are engaged. and how eventually how value is delivered over time. And so again, we have sort of a review here, but the predictive environments focus on baselines, phase review, and formal change control. Adaptive depends more on cadence, transparency, and feedback and ongoing reprioritization. Iterative and incremental models place more emphasis on progressive learning and partial value delivery, while hybrid models require the project manager to coordinate multiple control approaches across different parts of the work. This is important understanding we need for project performance management. Strong project managers don't simply apply the same monitor control logic to every project. They adjust their performance management approach to fit the lifecycle model, the level of uncertainty, and the type of value the project is expected to produce. The takeaways from this presentation is strong performance depends on principled leadership, an appropriate lifecycle, and performance management approach that fits the work. So the main takeaway is that project performance should be understood as more than just completing tasks or progress and process compliance. And we talked about how PMBOK 7 frames was kind of the first attempt of PMI to frame project management around principles and performance domains, and shifts attention towards value, outcomes, leadership, stakeholder engagement, and integrated performance. And then PMBOK 8 keeps that integrated perspective, but simplifies and restructures the framework in ways that are useful to understand during the transition period. And the second takeaway is that the development approaches and lifecycle models are not just delivery mechanics. They shape how project performance is managed. The model selected and affects planning, measurement, control, and stakeholder engagement, feedback, and the way value is delivered over time. And finally, strong project managers don't rely on a single management style for every project. They look at the work, the uncertainty, the stakeholder environment, and the organizational context, then choose a performance management approach that fits. In that sense, project performance is strongest when the principles, value, and contextual fit all work together. So that's the end. Thank you. Let me stop the share here.